The year was 1095. Europe stood restless, fractured by endless wars and rivalries. Yet from the heart of Christendom, a call was about to rise that would bind kings, knights, and peasants under a single divine banner. When Pope Urban II addressed the crowd in the town of Clermont, his words carried the weight of eternity. He spoke of a land far to the east, a land where Christ had walked, where his tomb lay in the hands of those deemed infidels. The Pope's voice trembled not with doubt, but with fervor. He promised absolution for sins, salvation for the soul, and eternal glory for those who would take up arms in the name of God. Deus vult, he declared. God wills it. The words became a battle cry that swept across Europe like wildfire. From the cold coasts of Normandy to the sunlit hills of Italy, men sold their lands, left their homes, and swore to march to Jerusalem. They were driven by faith, by fear, and by the promise of heaven itself. The First Crusade was born, a river of humanity flowing eastward, burdened with crosses and dreams of redemption. But the road to the Holy Land was no pilgrimage of peace. It was a march through hunger, disease, and death. Thousands perished before ever seeing the city they sought to reclaim. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, they found a city fortified and defiant. For 40 days they besieged its walls under the scorching sun, until at last, the gates fell. The soldiers of Christ entered with swords drawn and hearts burning with zeal. For them, it was divine justice. For history, it was a river of blood. Jerusalem was theirs, but conquest brought not peace, only responsibility. The Crusaders now ruled a kingdom surrounded by enemies, and the roads that led to the holy city ran through lands of danger and lawlessness. Pilgrims from every corner of Christendom began to arrive, seeking to walk in the footsteps of their Savior. Many never reached the city. They were robbed, killed, or taken by slave traders long before the Holy Sepulchre came into sight. Out of that peril, a new kind of knight would emerge. Not a knight of pride or greed, but of vow and faith. Among them was a man named Hugues de Payens, a French noble whose courage was matched only by his devotion. With a handful of companions, he took an oath before the Patriarch of Jerusalem. They vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience, and above all, the defense of Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It was a name born of humility, but their purpose would make them legends. In the ruins of the Temple Mount, they found both their home and their destiny. From these humble beginnings, a brotherhood would rise, one that would soon command the respect of kings, the fear of empires, and the mystery of centuries to come. The Knights Templar were born. In the aftermath of conquest, the Holy Land stood fragile. Jerusalem was a beacon, but its light flickered in the winds of war. The Crusader kings were too few, their armies stretched thin, and the desert roads swarmed with bandits and raiders. The pilgrims who came to pray often found only peril. Amid this chaos, a small brotherhood began to take shape, born not from royal decree, but from conviction. 9 knights gathered under one vision, to defend the defenseless in the name of Christ. They were led by Hugues de Payens, a man of quiet strength, whose faith was sharper than his sword. His comrades were men of noble blood, yet they cast aside luxury and title. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the same vows as monks, but their prayers would be made in battle. They sought no land, no gold, and no glory. Their cause was protection, their temple, the battlefield. For lodging, King Baldwin II of Jerusalem offered them quarters within a wing of the royal palace, built atop the ancient ruins of Solomon's temple. And it was there that their name took root, the Knights of the Temple of Solomon. In time, the world would know them simply as the Templars. At first, their numbers were small and their purpose humble. They escorted pilgrims through the perilous passes between Jaffa and Jerusalem, riding ahead to scout for ambushes, sharing their food with strangers, and burying those who fell along the way. They lived as soldiers of faith, poor in possessions, rich in devotion. But word of their discipline began to spread. In an age when knights were feared for arrogance and cruelty, these men lived as warriors of piety. They owned nothing. They slept on straw. Their armor was plain, their horses shared 2 by 2. On their banner was no boast of family or fortune, only a red cross, simple and stark, stitched upon a field of white. Years passed before their order was truly recognized. Many doubted them. A band of poor knights guarding travelers seemed a dream too naive to endure. But destiny had greater plans. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes in France, the Church gave them its blessing. With the support of the powerful Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, the Templars were granted legitimacy, and a rule of life written in the language of faith and war. Bernard's words echoed through Christendom. These knights are both monks and soldiers. They fear neither the flesh nor the devil. When they strike, they serve Christ. When they die, they gain heaven. The Church had given them not only approval, but purpose. The Templars were now the spiritual sword of Christendom. From France to England, from Spain to the Rhine, young men of noble birth sought to join their ranks. They gave up wealth and title, trading silk for chain mail, and comfort for the certainty of sacrifice. Their power grew, not through conquest, but through faith and reputation. The order's code was rigid. No laughter at table. No idle speech. No pride in victory. A Templar was to fight without fear, live without excess, and die without hesitation. They became the guardians of the Holy Land, the shield of pilgrims, the hammer of Islam, and the conscience of kings. Every battle they fought was a prayer, every death a sacrifice. They believed their swords served not men, but God Himself. And in time, even kings began to tremble before their resolve. For these Knights of the Temple answered to no crown, no lord, and no earthly master. Their loyalty was to the Pope alone. Their allegiance was eternal. The Templars had begun as a handful of humble warriors. Now, they were becoming the most disciplined, feared, and admired brotherhood in Christendom. But their rise had only begun, and with it, the seeds of both glory and destruction were already sown. The sun rose hard and merciless over the Holy Land. The sands of Palestine shimmered like fire, and the air carried the scent of dust and death. Here, the Knights Templar found their purpose, not in monasteries or cathedrals, but in the roar of battle and the silence that followed. They were no longer a handful of poor warriors. They had become the mailed fist of Christendom, the disciplined core of every Crusader army. When others faltered, the Templars held the line. When others fled, they stood their ground. To abandon the battlefield was to abandon God, and for them, such betrayal was worse than death. Each Templar rode into war dressed in white, marked by the crimson cross of martyrdom. Their oath forbade retreat unless outnumbered 3-1, and even then, they would hold until the banner of Christ fell. To fight without fear, to die without regret, that was their creed. For them, the clash of steel was prayer, the battlefield, a chapel consecrated by blood. The Muslims who faced them soon learned that these were no ordinary knights. They fought not for gold, nor even for survival, but for eternity. Chroniclers wrote that when the Templars charged, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Their discipline was absolute, their formation unbreakable. Even the great generals of Islam, men like Saladin, came to respect their courage, even as they sought their destruction. For years, the Templars defended the fragile Crusader states, Outremer, the land beyond the sea. From the fortresses of Acre, Tripoli, and Antioch, they watched the desert horizons, ever waiting for the next storm of war. They built castles of unmatched strength, stone citadels that rose like islands in a sea of hostility. Among them stood Croix de Chevaliers, a fortress so vast and defiant that it seemed born from the rock itself. These fortresses were not only military strongholds but sanctuaries of faith, places where warriors knelt before battle and confessed their sins beneath flickering candlelight. The Templars became the vanguard of every crusade that followed. They marched under the same symbol that had once been drawn in blood on the walls of Jerusalem, the Red Cross, a mark of sacrifice and salvation. They were the protectors of the Holy Sepulchre, the enforcers of the fragile peace between Christian and Muslim lands, and the first to ride when that peace was shattered. Their reputation spread across Europe. In the courts of kings and the halls of nobles, stories were told of these warrior monks who charged into battle chanting psalms. For common men, they were living saints. For rulers, they were instruments of divine will. Their victories were celebrated as miracles, their defeats mourned as martyrdoms. Yet, behind their devotion lay the brutal truth of holy war. The Crusades were no longer pilgrimages of faith, they had become campaigns of conquest, fueled by greed and vengeance. And though the Templars fought for Christ, they could not escape the blood that stained every victory. The Holy Land became a graveyard of both faiths, where men died believing they served God, while God remained silent. Still, the Templars endured. They built new chapters across Europe, trained new recruits, and refined their art of war to perfection. Their order grew into an international brotherhood, bound not by nation but by creed. They learned from their enemies, adopting their tactics, armor, and even their horses. In battle, they combined European steel with Eastern cunning, faith with discipline, and hope with unyielding resolve. The banner of the temple became a symbol of strength, black on one side, white on the other, signifying death to the enemies of Christ and purity of soul to those who served him. Wherever it flew, men knew the Templars stood near, incorruptible, unstoppable, unafraid. But power invites envy, and faith invites doubt. The Templars' victories made them heroes, their wealth and independence made them dangerous. And as the Crusades dragged on, the dream of a united Christendom began to fade. The Holy Land slipped through their fingers, one city at a time. Jerusalem was lost again, and with it, the certainty that God favored their cause. For the first time, cracks began to appear in the armor of faith. The Templars would fight on for another century, holding the last Christian outposts against the rising tide of Islam. But each battle brought them closer to exhaustion, and each defeat whispered the same question. Had God turned away? The age of blood and faith was reaching its limit. What had begun as a holy mission was becoming a burden too heavy for even the bravest knights to bear. And soon, the battlefield would no longer be the desert, but the heart of Europe itself. War had made the Templars famous. Discipline had made them respected. But it was organization, quiet, relentless, and precise, that made them powerful beyond any army in Christendom. As the Crusades continued, gold began to flow through their hands like water through a sacred channel. Knights from every corner of Europe donated their lands and fortunes to the temple, believing they were buying a share in heaven itself. Kings granted privileges. Popes issued decrees. And soon, the order of the temple became an empire without borders, a brotherhood answerable only to God and the Holy See. They built commanderies from England to Jerusalem, each one a fortress and a bank, a sanctuary and a school of war. Every Templar property was a cog in a vast machine that stretched across Christendom, fields feeding garrisons, ports fueling ships, treasuries moving wealth like blood through veins. They were no longer simply soldiers of the cross. They had become the accountants of faith, the bankers of kings, and the keepers of secrets. In time, the Templars developed a system so advanced it would one day shape the foundations of modern finance. A pilgrim traveling to Jerusalem could deposit his gold in a Templar house in Paris and withdraw the same value in Acre or Tyre. It was the world's first network of international credit, and it was guarded not by clerks, but by knights sworn to die before breaking their oath. The Templars' seal, two knights riding a single horse, once a symbol of poverty, now carried a deeper meaning. It spoke of brotherhood, unity, and sacrifice. But to the world, it also came to signify immense trust and unbreakable power. Their wealth grew not from greed but from necessity. Wars were expensive, castles costly, and armies hungry. To fund their holy mission, they traded in goods, lent money, and managed estates. Yet their vow of poverty remained intact, for no individual Templar owned a single coin. Everything belonged to the order, and the order belonged to God. Still, their influence could not go unnoticed. Princes borrowed from them, merchants depended on them, even the church turned to them for financial aid. They became indispensable and untouchable. In battle, they had feared no enemy. In peace, they began to fear none among men. Their fortresses across Europe rose like monuments to discipline, stone walls guarding not only treasure, but information. Each house was a mirror of the next, the same code, the same rituals, the same unyielding obedience. Every Templar could ride into any land and find brothers ready to shelter him. Their loyalty transcended nations, and their secrecy became legend. To outsiders, the Templars seemed to live under divine favor. Their order was pure, their power godly, their purpose unshakable. But within their walls, they knew the truth: the Holy Land was slipping away. Despite their wealth and might, they could not stop the tide. City after city fell to the armies of Islam. The Christian kingdoms of the East crumbled like sand under a rising sea. When Jerusalem was lost again, the Templars did not abandon their vow. They moved their headquarters to Acre, and when Acre too was taken, they retreated to Cyprus. Even in defeat, they stood unbroken, their spirit forged by faith, their pride shielded by discipline. In Europe, however, the world was changing. The crusading dream had faded, the zeal of the faithful had cooled. Kings who once gloried in the holy cause now hungered for wealth and power at home. And the Templars, who owned vast lands, commanded loyal men, and answered to no earthly ruler, became a tempting target. They had survived the swords of their enemies, but a new kind of weapon was rising: envy, suspicion, and fear. Their immense riches stirred jealousy, their secrecy inspired rumors, their loyalty to the Pope provoked resentment in monarchs who craved absolute control. To many, the Templars had become a state within a state, a church within the church itself. Whispers began to circulate that their rites were heretical, their vows deceptive, their faith corrupted by the treasures of the world. And in the dark corners of royal courts, plots began to form. Men who could not defeat the Templars in war sought to destroy them through accusation and deceit. The cross that had once inspired awe would soon invite suspicion. The white mantle, once a symbol of holiness, would become the mark of doom. The Templars had risen higher than any order before them. And from such heights, there was only one direction left to fall. The sun that once blazed over the banners of Christendom now sank in silence. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem, once the heart of faith and conquest, began to fade beneath the weight of time and war. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had stood as the guardians of the Holy Land. They had built fortresses on barren mountains, shed blood for stones, and buried brothers in sands that never kept their promise of peace. But even the mightiest fortress cannot stand forever against the tide of destiny. In the year 1187, the balance of power shifted. A new leader had risen among the Muslim forces, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. He was a man of strategy and mercy, discipline and honor, qualities that mirrored those of the Templars themselves. To the Christians, he was a formidable foe; to his followers, he was the sword of justice. At Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee, the armies of the cross met the armies of the crescent. The desert burned like a furnace. The Crusaders marched under a cruel sun, their water gone, their faith tested. When the battle began, it was not a clash of men, but of wills, of 2 visions of divine purpose. The Templars fought with the fury of conviction, yet the desert had already claimed their strength. Encircled and outnumbered, they fell one by one. Those who survived were captured, those who refused to renounce their faith were executed. When the smoke cleared, the Holy Cross, the relic carried into battle, was gone. Saladin's victory was complete. Within months, Jerusalem surrendered. The Holy City was lost once more. For the Templars, it was more than a defeat. It was the collapse of their reason for being. They had vowed to protect pilgrims to the Holy Sepulchre, but now, the sepulchre itself was beyond their reach. The roads they once guarded were in enemy hands, the sacred walls they had bled for now echoed with the prayers of another faith. Yet even in despair, the Templars did not abandon their vow. They retreated to the coast, rebuilding what they could. Acre became their new stronghold, a fortress of stone and faith, a final bastion of Christendom in the east. From there, they continued the fight, launching raids, defending pilgrims, and waiting for another crusade that would never truly come. Europe had changed. The fire that once sent armies eastward had cooled into embers. Kings now fought kings, and the cause of Christ no longer united them. The Church still spoke of holy war, but few listened. The glory of Jerusalem had become a memory, and the Templars, once heroes, now seemed relics of a fading age. Still, they endured. They trained, they prayed, and they built. Their castles, in Syria, Cyprus, and along the Mediterranean, stood as symbols of defiance. But every year, their lines grew thinner, their brothers fewer. The sea became their last frontier, their ships the last hope of supply and survival. When Acre finally fell in 1291, the last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land was gone. The knights who survived fled to Cyprus, carrying with them not treasure, but sorrow. The sands of the east had swallowed their purpose, and the cause that had once united Christendom was dead. For the first time, the Templars were knights without a holy war. Their blades had no battlefield, their prayers no pilgrimage. They had defended a dream until it turned to dust, and yet, even in exile, they remained loyal to their code. In Europe, their wealth and organization still commanded respect. Their fleet sailed the Mediterranean, their estates stretched across kingdoms. But their mission, the reason for their very existence, had vanished. Without the Holy Land, the Templars' faith stood naked before the ambitions of kings and the suspicions of men. The fall of Jerusalem had not only marked the loss of a city. It marked the beginning of the end for the Knights of the Temple. They had given everything to defend a holy kingdom that could not be kept, and now, in the quiet halls of Europe, their silence began to sound like guilt. The same discipline that had once inspired awe now seemed arrogance. The same independence that had once been holy now appeared dangerous. The same secrecy that had once protected them now bred whispers of heresy. They had conquered their enemies in battle, but the enemies that would destroy them were already among their friends. The 12th century had begun with triumph. Jerusalem had stood as a beacon of Christian victory, and the Templars, once humble monks, had become guardians of a sacred kingdom. But time, like the desert wind, erodes even stone. And the tide of destiny was turning. The first shadow fell at Hattin. The summer of 1187 burned hotter than any before. The Crusader armies, proud and overconfident, marched out to face a new kind of leader, a man both warrior and scholar, fierce yet just. His name was Salah ad-Din, known to the West as Saladin. Under his banner of green, the Muslim armies moved with precision and faith. Saladin was no mere conqueror, he was a strategist guided by patience and principle. He understood that the Crusaders' greatest weakness was not their swords, but their pride. At the horns of Hattin, near the shimmering waters of Galilee, two great forces collided beneath a merciless sun. The Crusaders were thirsty, exhausted, and surrounded. Their banners of red and white shimmered weakly against the haze. The Templars fought like men possessed, their discipline unbroken even as the world seemed to fall apart around them. But the outcome was already written in the dust. Saladin's forces encircled them, cutting off escape, crushing the Crusader line with waves of horsemen and fire. Smoke filled the sky. When the battle ended, the cross of Christ lay shattered in the sand. Nearly every knight of Jerusalem was slain or taken prisoner. King Guy was captured. The true cross, the holiest relic of all, was seized by Saladin's hand. Among the fallen were scores of Templars. Those who survived were brought before the Sultan. Saladin, though merciful to most, saw in the Templars not just enemies of Islam, but instruments of war. He offered them no ransom, no redemption. One by one, the Knights of the Temple met their fate, heads bowed, lips whispering final prayers. In October of that same year, Jerusalem surrendered. For the first time in nearly a century, the Holy City once again belonged to the East. No massacre followed, no river of blood. Saladin showed mercy where the Crusaders once had not. But the shock of Jerusalem's fall echoed across Christendom like thunder. In Europe, kings wept. Preachers cried that God was testing his faithful. And once again, a new crusade was born, one greater, louder, and far more desperate than the first. The Third Crusade brought forth giants, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip of France, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. And alongside them, the unbroken brothers of the Temple. Though their numbers had been diminished, their resolve had not. They would once more carry the cross into battle, this time not as conquerors, but as avengers. In the years that followed, the Templars fought in every major campaign of the Third Crusade. They defended the coast, manned the fortresses, and rode at the forefront of Richard's armies. They did not reclaim Jerusalem, but they ensured that the Crusader kingdoms did not die. Their courage became legend. Their loyalty became their creed. But as the tides of war shifted back and forth between East and West, the Templars began to see a new truth, that no kingdom on earth could last forever. The Holy Land was changing, and so was Europe. The age of chivalric faith was beginning to give way to something colder, politics, power, and greed. For now, the Temple endured. But in the silence that followed Hattin, something sacred had been lost. The dream of a united Christendom had cracked, and the echo of that defeat would haunt the Templars to their final day. By the dawn of the 13th century, the Knights Templar had become more than warriors. They were no longer simply monks who fought, they were an institution, a kingdom without borders, and a power unto themselves. From the ashes of the Crusader losses, the Templars built something new, an empire of faith, discipline, and influence that stretched from the battlefields of the Holy Land to the cathedrals of Europe. Where kings fell, they endured. Where empires wavered, their order stood firm, unshaken, unbroken, unyielding. Their white mantles marked with the red cross became symbols of divine purpose. To the people of Europe, they were the sword of God, holy knights who protected pilgrims, fought infidels, and carried Christ's mission beyond the sea. But behind their sacred image lay an order of astonishing intelligence and organization. The Templars were no longer just men of war. They became the first international bankers. Their preceptories, scattered across France, England, Spain, and Portugal, acted as nodes in a vast financial network. A pilgrim in London could deposit his gold in a Templar commandery, and withdraw it safely in Jerusalem. Letters of credit, sealed with the cross, replaced the heavy weight of coins. It was a system centuries ahead of its time. Their wealth grew quietly. Not through greed, but through efficiency. They owned farms, mills, vineyards, ports, and ships. They lent money to nobles and kings alike, not to enrich themselves, but to fund the defense of the faith. Yet in doing so, they became indispensable and dangerously powerful. Their fortresses rose like stone sentinels across the Mediterranean world. In Acre, Tortosa, and Cyprus, the Templar castles stood as marvels of medieval engineering, their walls thick enough to defy siege engines, their towers built to command both sea and desert. No fortress was stronger, no knights more feared. To friend and foe alike, the Templars seemed touched by something otherworldly. They did not break. They did not yield. When the call came to defend a fortress, they stood to the last man. And when they died in silence, their faith their only cry. But with every victory, their mystery deepened. Whispers spread through Europe that the Templars had found relics of unimaginable power beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. That they guarded the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or the secrets of eternal life. No proof was ever shown, yet the rumors grew. And with them, so did the awe and envy surrounding the order. In the courts of kings, their influence was immense. They advised monarchs, financed crusades, and even mediated disputes between nations. They answered to no king, no bishop, and no crown, only to the Pope himself. This independence made them respected by some, and feared by many. In time, that fear would become suspicion. And suspicion would become hatred. But for now, the temple stood at its zenith, its banners flying high across continents, its name spoken with reverence. They had begun as a handful of poor knights protecting pilgrims. Now, they were the most powerful military order the world had ever seen. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ had become an empire in all but name, an empire of faith, stone, and gold. Yet in every empire lies the seed of its own destruction. And the higher the Templars rose, the more perilous the fall that awaited them. The year was 1291. For nearly 2 centuries, the cross had flown over the shores of the Holy Land, battered, bloodied, but unbroken. Now, that final flame of Christendom flickered in one last fortress by the sea, Acre. The once proud city was a jewel of Crusader power, a haven of merchants, pilgrims, and warriors. Its walls rose high above the waves, guarded by towers of stone and banners of the Templar cross. From within those walls, the last remnants of the Latin kingdom held their ground, a fragile island of faith surrounded by an ocean of enemies. But the world had changed. The great Crusader armies were gone. Europe had grown weary of holy wars, and kings now quarreled over gold and crowns, not relics and redemption. The Templars, the Hospitallers, and a few scattered knights stood alone against the full might of the Mamluk Sultanate. In Egypt, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil gathered an army unlike any seen before. Tens of thousands of soldiers, siege engines, and ships marched north toward Acre. Their purpose was clear, to drive the last Crusaders into the sea and erase the Latin kingdoms forever. When the Mamluk army appeared on the horizon, the sky seemed to darken. The ground trembled under the weight of their march. From the ramparts, the Templars watched in silence, not with fear, but with grim resolve. They had sworn to defend the Holy Land, and this would be their final stand. The siege began in the spring. The thunder of catapults echoed day and night. Stones the size of oxen crashed against the city's walls, shaking its foundations. Fires swept through the streets. Still, the Templars fought on, their white mantles now stained with ash and blood. From every tower, from every gate, they repelled the Mamluk assault. For weeks, Acre held, a miracle carved out of courage and faith. But no reinforcements came. Europe had turned away. The Holy Land was forgotten. In May, the walls finally cracked. The Mamluk surged into the city like a storm. The streets became rivers of chaos, screams, smoke, steel. The Knights of the Temple formed a final line around their fortress by the sea. They fought not for victory, but for honor. Within the great Templar stronghold, survivors, soldiers, women, and children took refuge behind walls thought to be impenetrable. For 10 days, the Templars held the enemy at bay. Every assault was met with fury. Every breach was sealed with blood. But the end was inevitable. The Mamluks tunneled beneath the fortress, planting explosives that shattered its foundations. The walls crumbled. The sea poured in. And the last defenders of Acre fell beneath the ruins of their own sanctuary. The Templar standard, the red cross on white, sank beneath the smoke and the waves. The Holy Land was lost. The age of the Crusades had ended. From that day, no Christian kingdom remained in the East. Jerusalem was gone. Antioch was gone. And now Acre, the last bastion of the cross, was nothing but ashes and memory. Those who escaped fled to Cyprus, carrying what relics and records they could save. They left behind the bones of brothers, the ruins of fortresses, and a silence that would haunt the order forever. The dream that had begun with Pope Urban's call at Clermont, the dream of a holy kingdom in the East, was over. But the Knights Templar did not vanish. They turned their eyes westward, to Europe. There, new battles awaited, not against armies, but against kings, debts, and the shifting tides of power. The Templars had survived the fall of Acre. But in surviving, they had entered a new kind of war, one that would not be fought with swords, but with lies, envy, and betrayal. The fall of Acre marked the end of one world, and the beginning of another. The Holy Land was lost, but the Knights Templar still lived. They returned to Europe not as heroes of victory, but as relics of a forgotten crusade. Their ships carried the wounded and the weary to the island of Cyprus, their new stronghold, their last refuge. There, among the stone halls of Limassol, they began again. They trained, rebuilt, and waited, for a new crusade that would never come. Europe, once united under the cry of Deus Vult, had changed. The kings who had once begged the Templars for help now ruled their realms with cold ambition. Faith was no longer the sword of destiny, it was the language of politics. The order, once born from poverty and piety, had become immensely powerful. Their castles dotted the hills of France and Spain. Their treasuries overflowed with coin. Their ships sailed from England to the Levant. And their ledgers, written in secret codes, held the debts of nations. They had become the guardians of wealth, the bankers of kings. And in that wealth lay their doom. In France, a young and ambitious monarch watched the Templars with growing envy. Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, was tall, calculating, and utterly ruthless. His coffers were empty, drained by wars and extravagance. His debts to the Templars ran deep, deeper than his pride could bear. To Philip, the order was no longer holy, it was a rival power. And in a kingdom where the king believed himself chosen by God, no rival could be tolerated. The Pope at the time, Clement V, was weak, more politician than priest. He owed his throne to Philip, and his loyalty soon followed. In the shadows of power, a silent conspiracy began to form, one that would stain Christendom forever. Whispers spread across France, whispers of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption within the temple. That the knights worshipped idols, spat on the cross, and denied Christ in secret rituals. No proof was offered. No witnesses without fear. Yet the rumors grew, planted by royal hands, fed by greed, and believed by the ignorant. The Templars, bound by vows of silence and obedience, did not defend themselves publicly. They believed their honor would protect them, that the truth would prevail. But honor is a poor shield against kings. In 1307, on a cold October morning, Philip struck. Across France, at the very hour of dawn, royal guards stormed every Templar house, every commandery, every chapel. Thousands of knights were seized in a single day. Their properties confiscated, their brothers dragged in chains before the throne. The charges were blasphemy. The punishment, death. In Paris, the Grand Master of the Temple, Jacques de Molay, was taken prisoner. He was old, weary, yet unbroken. Under torture, many knights confessed to crimes they never committed, confessions ripped from their souls by the rack and the flame. When the pain ceased, they recanted. They swore before God that the order was pure, that their faith was true. But Philip needed not truth, only justification. The Inquisition began its grim work. One by one, the Templars vanished into dungeons, never to return. Their lands were seized by the crown, their wealth absorbed by royal hands. Europe, once indebted to the Knights of the Temple, now turned its face away. The same kings who had ridden beside them in the Holy Land now pretended not to remember. The Pope, under pressure, dissolved the order, not for guilt, but for peace. The Temple was broken. Its brothers scattered, imprisoned, or burned. Yet in the shadows, the legend began to take root. For an order so mighty to fall so swiftly, it seemed almost impossible. People whispered that the Templars had hidden their treasures before the arrests. That ships had sailed from La Rochelle, vanishing into the mist. That the gold of the Temple, and perhaps its greatest secrets, were never found. The seeds of betrayal had been sown. And from them, myths would grow, myths of hidden power, secret rites, and vengeance that would echo through the centuries. The order of the Temple had been betrayed by kings and silenced by popes. But their story was far from over. For truth, like faith, cannot be burned, only buried. And buried things have a way of returning. The year was 1307. The dawn that rose over France that October was colder than any before it, not in air, but in spirit. The world had changed overnight. An empire of faith had been brought to its knees, not by sword or siege, but by deceit and fear. The Knights Templar, once the guardians of the Holy Land, protectors of pilgrims, and champions of Christendom, now stood accused as heretics. Their white mantles, once symbols of purity, were torn and soiled. Their sacred halls were sealed by royal decree. The Order of the Temple was now an order of prisoners. King Philip IV of France had made his move with ruthless precision. He declared that the Templars had betrayed the faith, that they worshipped idols, kissed demons, and spat upon the cross. To the common people, the accusations were unthinkable, and yet, in an age ruled by fear and faith, even the unthinkable could be believed. Torture chambers replaced chapels. The confessions Philip demanded were not confessions of truth, but of pain. Knights who had faced Saracen blades without flinching now screamed beneath the instruments of the Inquisition. Bones were stretched, flesh was burned, and faith itself was twisted into a weapon. Many confessed, broken, bleeding, desperate for mercy. They admitted to heresy, witchcraft, and every falsehood their captors desired. But when the torturers stepped away, when the ink dried and the flames cooled, they recanted. They swore again by Christ that their confessions were lies, torn from their lips by agony. Still, the machinery of power moved forward. In towns and cities across Europe, the Templars were put on trial. The evidence was hollow. The witnesses were terrified. But truth mattered little when the verdict had already been written. In Paris, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was brought before a tribunal of priests and judges. He was an old man now, his hair silver, his face marked by years of imprisonment. Yet his voice remained calm, resolute, unbroken. He denied every charge. He declared the order innocent before God and men. He demanded justice, not for himself, but for his brothers, men who had lived and died by the vow of the cross. But justice had no place in Philip's kingdom. The Pope, Clement V, fearful of royal wrath, disbanded the order in 1312. He did not condemn it outright, he simply erased it from existence. The Templar name was to vanish from law, from church, from history itself. Their lands were handed to the Hospitallers. Their fortresses were emptied. Their ships were seized. Their brotherhood, scattered to the winds. Yet not all were captured. Some fled across the sea, to England, to Scotland, to Portugal. In distant lands, they found shelter beneath sympathetic crowns. And there, in silence, the legacy of the Temple endured, hidden, perhaps, but never dead. In France, however, Philip demanded one final act, one final spectacle to seal the fate of the order forever. He ordered the execution of Jacques de Molay. On a cold March evening in 1314, the Grand Master was led to the Isle de la Cite, in the heart of Paris. Before him burned two pyres, one for him, one for his brother-in-arms, Geoffrey de Charny. Crowds gathered to watch the end of an age. The air was heavy with smoke and fear. Molay stood tall, his hands bound, his eyes fixed upon the Cathedral of Notre Dame rising in the distance. When the sentence was read, he did not beg. He did not curse. He raised his voice above the crackle of the fire and spoke words that would echo through the centuries. God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Soon, those who have condemned us will face his judgment. Pope Clement, King Philip, before this year ends, I summon you to stand with me before the throne of God. The flames rose. The Grand Master did not cry out. He met death as he had lived, with faith, courage, and silence. And legend says, his words came true. Within the year, both the Pope and the King were dead. The order of the temple was gone, its halls empty, its banners burned, its name whispered only in secret. But its spirit, its mystery, its defiance, those would live on. In the shadows of Europe, the Red Cross still flickered, faint, but eternal. The world had witnessed not the death of heretics, but the martyrdom of knights. And in that martyrdom, the Templars passed from history into legend. The flames that consumed Jacques de Molay did not consume the order's spirit. The fire died, the ashes scattered, but the legend, it lived. What began as a brotherhood of humble knights became a myth that would echo through 1,000 years. When the pyres cooled, Europe thought the Templars were gone. Their castles were abandoned, their treasury seized, their symbols outlawed. But stories began to spread, whispers of knights who escaped the king's reach, carrying with them gold, relics, and secrets too powerful to die. In Portugal, the Templars found sanctuary under a new name, the Order of Christ. There, they continued their work under royal protection, their red cross now a mark of discovery rather than war. Centuries later, it would sail upon the sails of explorers like Henry the Navigator, guiding ships into unknown seas. Through them, the Templar spirit helped chart the world. In Scotland, legend tells of Templar knights who fled across the sea and found refuge under Robert the Bruce. When Scotland stood against England at Bannockburn, it is said, in whispers, that shadowy riders bearing the Red Cross appeared upon the field, turning the tide of battle. No chronicler confirmed it, yet no historian has ever silenced it. For where legend meets hope, truth becomes eternal. The centuries that followed transformed the Templars from warriors into mystery. Alchemists claimed their secrets. Mystics claimed their symbols. And secret societies claimed their legacy. From the Freemasons to the Rosicrucians, countless brotherhoods traced their origins to the lost temple. Whether by truth or by desire, all sought to inherit their power, the power of faith disciplined by knowledge. Even the Holy Grail, that eternal symbol of divine mystery, became entwined with their name. Some said the Templars found it beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. Others swore they guarded it in silence, passing it from generation to generation. The truth, like the Grail itself, remained hidden, not lost, perhaps, but waiting. Yet beyond treasure, beyond secrets, the true legacy of the Templars lies in what they became. They were the first to unite faith with structure, courage with order, belief with purpose. They built the foundations of modern banking, international law, and disciplined brotherhood. They proved that even in a world ruled by kings and popes, men bound by oath could move mountains. Their downfall was not their failure, it was their greatness. They rose too high, too independent, too untouchable. And in the end, it was not the sword of Islam or the fire of battle that destroyed them, it was the jealousy of kings and the fear of power that could not be controlled. But their story did not die in the smoke of Paris. It lived in the architecture of cathedrals, in the emblems carved upon ancient stone, and in the hearts of those who believe that honor can outlive empires. Every time a man stands for faith against corruption, every time courage defies tyranny, the spirit of the Templar rides again. Centuries have passed. The world they knew, of swords, banners, and crusades, is gone. Yet the Red Cross endures, a symbol of purity, discipline, and sacrifice. The Templars were warriors of God, but also men, flawed, human, and immortalized by history. They were betrayed, condemned, and burned. But they were never truly defeated. For in the end, no king, no pope, no flame can destroy what is eternal. Faith, brotherhood, and the will to serve something greater than oneself. The Templars may have vanished from the earth, but in legend, they ride forever. Their journey, their faith, their mystery will never end.